Very little is known with certainty about Tarrare's early life, even down to the exact details of his birth and family. He appears to have been born around 1772 in rural France. By all surviving accounts, his condition began when he was still very young. He possessed an appetite so extreme that it was beyond ordinary gluttony and beyond the understanding of anyone around him. As a teenager, he was reportedly able to eat a quarter of a bullock's carcass in a single day, an amount of food far beyond anything a normal human body could consume. His family, unable or unwilling to support a son whose appetite threatened to bankrupt the household, eventually drove him away. From that point, Tarrare drifted. In pre-revolutionary and revolutionary France, cities and roads were full of men like him in one sense, wanderers trying to survive from one day to the next. But Tarrare quickly learned that his misery could be turned into spectacle. He fell in with traveling charlatans and street performers who exhibited human curiosities for coins. In marketplaces and public squares, Tarrare made himself into a sideshow. Crowds gathered to watch the gaunt young man swallow astonishing quantities of food and objects that no one else would willingly put in their mouth. He ate apples by the basket, corks, stones, and whatever else might shock an audience into paying. What made him so disturbing was not just the amount he consumed, but the contradiction of his body. He was not a giant. He was not massively overweight. In fact, descriptions suggest he remained relatively thin and underweight, despite eating enough for many men. Observers said his skin was loose and hot to the touch, that he sweated heavily, and that a terrible smell clung to him almost constantly. When he had not eaten, his abdomen would sag in folds. After a huge meal, it would swell tight and distended. His jaw was said to open unusually wide, and he could sometimes be seen swallowing with a speed and indifference that unsettled even hardened onlookers. Then came war. In 1792, revolutionary France was fighting the war of the First Coalition against several European powers, and like many poor young men, Tarrare entered the army. Military service did not improve his condition. If anything, it exposed it more dramatically. A normal soldier's ration could not sustain him for even a fraction of the day. He ate his own food and then scavenged among the leftovers of other soldiers. Even when his rations were increased, it made no lasting difference. Hunger pursued him like a disease. Eventually, his condition became impossible for the military to ignore. Weak, exhausted, and still ravenously hungry, he was admitted to a military hospital where doctors encountered a case unlike anything they had seen before. Among those who took a deep interest in him was the military surgeon Pierre-François Percy, an intelligent and curious physician who would later record some of the most famous observations about Tarrare. To these doctors, Tarrare was both a patient and an opportunity. Revolutionary France was a place where science, military necessity, and spectacle often overlapped. A man who could seemingly swallow anything became not just a medical curiosity, but potentially a military asset. The physicians and officers around him began a series of observations and experiments. They tested the limits of his appetite. In one well-known demonstration, he was presented with a meal intended for 15 laborers and consumed it in a single sitting. On other occasions, he devoured huge quantities of meat, plates of offal, and astonishing amounts of food without any apparent satiety. Witnesses described him eating live animals or tearing into them with horrifying speed. The details vary by account, and some were clearly repeated because they were grotesque enough to linger in memory, but the central fact remained consistent. Tarrare could consume quantities and kinds of food that no one around him believed possible. He also seemed to exist in a constant state of physical misery. Despite the mountains of food, he never became healthy. He remained listless, often exhausted, and unable to control his urges. His smell was frequently described as overpowering, foul enough to make people retreat from him. Some doctors thought the odor became especially intense after he ate. His skin, mouth, and body all seemed marked by a pathological excess, as though the machinery of appetite had been permanently disordered. For the French military, however, the most intriguing fact was not how much he could eat, but what he could swallow whole and later pass. The army was fighting a modern war, and communication behind enemy lines mattered. If a message could be hidden inside a container, swallowed by a man, carried through enemy territory, and then recovered at the destination, that man might function as a living courier. Someone decided Tarrare might be exactly that instrument. The plan reflected both desperation and reckless imagination. Tarrare was asked to swallow a small wooden box containing a written message. Doctors and officers waited to see whether it could pass through his digestive system intact. It did. That was enough for the military to attempt a real operation. Tarrare was chosen for a covert mission into enemy territory. The idea was simple. He would swallow a message, cross through Prussian lines disguised as a peasant, reach a French contact, and then deliver the communication after nature took its course. On paper, it was ingenious. In practice, it was absurd. Tarrare was not the kind of man who could blend in quietly. His appearance, manner, and condition made him conspicuous. He was sent into enemy-held territory carrying a secret inside his body, but he lacked the calm disguise and discipline of a trained spy. He was captured almost immediately by Prussian forces. Once detained, he quickly aroused suspicion. Whether from his behavior, his inability to explain himself, or the strange attention he drew, the Prussians did not buy the act. The result was humiliating and terrifying. Tarrare was held prisoner, beaten, and eventually forced to reveal the nature of his mission. The swallowed message was recovered after a miserable delay. To make matters worse, the message itself reportedly contained little or no important intelligence. He may have been used partly as a test rather than entrusted with anything valuable. The Prussian commander, enraged or amused by the bizarre affair, is said to have subjected Tarrare to a mock execution before releasing him back to the French. Whatever the exact details, the experience shattered any illusion that he was suited to espionage. After this failure, Tarrare returned to the hospital and begged to be cured. If earlier he had been a useful curiosity, he now became a desperate man, asking doctors to free him from the appetite that ruled his life. Percy and other physicians attempted treatments, but medicine at the end of the 18th century was profoundly limited. They tried laudanum, they tried wine vinegar, they tried tobacco pills, they tried eggs and controlled diets. Nothing worked. If anything, Tarrare's behavior became more disturbing as time went on. In the hospital, where food was limited and temptation was everywhere, he scavenged ceaselessly. He was caught searching for scraps in gutters and refuse. He fought with animals over carrion. Reports emerged that he drank blood from hospital patients during bloodletting procedures. He prowled around areas where amputated limbs or corpses might be found. The line between medical horror and urban legend became blurred around him, but enough witnesses described his conduct that his reputation turned darker and darker. Then came the accusation that transformed him from grotesque patient into nightmare. At one point, a young child disappeared near the hospital. No clear proof linked Tarrare to the disappearance, but given his mounting notoriety and reports that he had attempted to eat body parts or sneak into the mortuary, suspicion immediately settled on him. Whether guilty or not in that specific case, he had become too frightening to keep under institutional supervision. His doctors could no longer protect him as a subject of curiosity. He vanished from the hospital and from reliable records for several years. For a time, he slips almost entirely into shadow. Then, in 1798, he reappeared in Versailles, terminally ill. He contacted Percy, the doctor who had known him before, and asked to see him again. Tarrare reportedly believed that the cause of his current suffering was a golden fork he had swallowed years earlier. He thought it had lodged inside him and was now killing him. Percy, however, recognized a much more familiar and hopeless picture. Tarrare was dying, probably of advanced tuberculosis, though his body had long since become such an anomaly that no one could separate the ordinary disease from the extraordinary one. His final decline was miserable. He was bedridden, weak, and still grotesquely abnormal in the eyes of the doctors attending him. He suffered severe diarrhea and worsening exhaustion. Then, shortly afterward, he died, likely still in his 20s. The man who had spent his life devoured by hunger finally ran out of time. After his death, the doctors performed an autopsy, hoping that at last the mystery would yield to anatomy. If they could not cure him in life, perhaps they could at least understand him in death. What they found was striking, though not conclusive. His gullet appeared abnormally wide. His jaw and mouth seemed capable of unusual expansion. His stomach was reported to be enormous, filling much of the abdominal cavity. Various internal organs appeared enlarged or abnormal. Yet, for all the horror and fascination of the examination, it did not produce a clear diagnosis. The stench from the body was reportedly so overpowering that even the doctors conducting the autopsy struggled to continue. In the end, medicine was left with observations, not answers. Tarrare's body seemed to confirm that something about him had been physically extreme, but it did not explain why he had lived in such constant hunger or why he could consume what he did without immediate death. The case remained unresolved. Over the centuries that followed, physicians and historians proposed explanations. Some have suggested hyperthyroidism, others damage to the hypothalamus, still others rare metabolic disorders, polyphagia linked to endocrine disease, psychiatric disturbance, parasitic infection, or a combination of conditions no one in his own time could possibly have diagnosed. There is even the possibility that some stories about him were exaggerated by repetition, by the appetite of gossip, or by the medical showmanship of the age. But most scholars agree on one essential point. Behind the embellishments was a real man with a profound, likely catastrophic disorder that made his life into a public spectacle and a private torment. What makes Tarrare endure in history is not simply that he was bizarre. History contains many bizarre figures. It is that his story sits at the intersection of medicine, war, hunger, and human curiosity. He lived in a time when the line between patient and exhibit was dangerously thin. Doctors studied him, officers used him, crowds stared at him, and almost no one could actually help him. The very thing that made him unforgettable also made him exploitable. In another era, he might have become the subject of laboratory tests, scans, endocrine studies, psychiatric care, and nutritional intervention. In 18th century France, he became a rumor with a pulse. A man passed from marketplace to army camp to hospital ward, from spectacle to military experiment to medical legend. The Revolution promised a new age of reason, but Tarrare's life revealed how little reason could do when the body itself became incomprehensible. And so he remains in the historical record as a figure who is almost unbearable to picture clearly. A hungry young man driven from home, a performer swallowing stones for coins, a soldier who could not be fed, a failed spy carrying secrets in his stomach, a hospital terror haunting the edges of mortuaries and refuse heaps, a dying patient convinced that a fork inside him was the final answer. He is remembered not as a hero or villain in any simple sense, but as one of history's strangest human tragedies. a man whose appetite turned him into a legend and whose suffering never found a cure.